Often when I get into conversations with my atheist friends, they will say things like, in the modern world, with all of our science and technology and philosophy, you cannot be intellectually honest as a 21st century human being and claim that God exists. And it's very difficult for me as a pastor and as someone who works for the Raven Foundation, where we seek to make religion reasonable, violence unthinkable, and peace a possibility, to admit this. But the atheists are right. It's true, you can't be intellectually honest and say that God exists. The problem is that the Judeo-Christian tradition has never said that God exists in the way that the atheists are claiming. God doesn't exist as a material object. You can't go out and find God and examine God's body and say, oh yes, that's God right there. The Judeo-Christian tradition has never said that God exists like this. In the beginning of the Bible, you have Genesis, and Genesis says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God creates the material world, but God is not part of the material world. God transcends the material world. And throughout the Bible, when humans have had a tendency to say that God is part of the material world, Jews and Christians both have said, no, that's idolatry. You can't do that. God doesn't exist as the material world. In the 5th century, you have this dude named Dionysius, and what Dionysius ends up saying is that God creates all that exists, but God doesn't, in fact, exist. And what he means is that God doesn't exist as a material being. And what Dionysius ends up saying is that the best way to talk about God is through negative terms. So God is not like this. God is not like that. Because he wants to avoid any kind of this idolatry. He wants to emphasize God is not part of the material world. Thomas Aquinas says something very similar, that God transcends the material world. Why does this matter? It matters because humans spend so much of our time in the material world arguing with one another, being in rivalry with one another, and being violent with one another. For example, we'll often get stuck in arguing about whether or not God exists. Me? And entirely miss the point. The point is, as Thomas Aquinas points to, that God is love. God is not on our material plane of being, and so God doesn't get caught up in our rivalries. And so Thomas Aquinas says that whereas we love things that we are attracted to, things that we like, God doesn't work like that. God just loves everything because it's part of God's creation that God made. And where does Thomas Aquinas get this? He gets this from Jesus. Take a look at the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, you want to become sons and daughters of God? And what this means is, do you want to become like God? He says, if you want to become sons and daughters of God, love your enemies. Why? Because that's what God does. God loves God's enemies. So forget about all of that talk about whether or not God exists. Become like God by loving your enemies. That's the point. And so to my atheist friends, you're right. And I love you. Okay, have a good day.